Tu mai Taranaki tike tike mai rā tātou. Roto I te kawatapu hapa I ngā tō mana toro tika ki arangi Toro tika ki arangi Tēnei te mihi atu kia tātou ko karapine pine mai I raro I te āhuru mōwai o tēnei whare kaunihera. Tuatahi ake ka tuku I o tātou mihi ki ngā mate huhua o te wā, ki ngā aitua, ka pātu, ki tēnā, o ngā whānau, o ngā hapu, o ngā iwi, o tia I aku hoa kaimahi I ngā rangitata nei. E whakaaro nui ana kia rātou te hunga mate. Rātou kia rātou, tātou kia tātou, ngā waihotanga iho, ngā kanohi hiora, kua huitahi mai nei ki te tautoko I tēnei kaupapa. Me mihi ka tika ki o tātou tangata whenua, mana whenua, e pupuru nei I te mauri o tēnei whenua. Arā, ko Ngāti Te Whiti, Ngāti Tāwhirikura, o tia, te atiawa, iwi, nui tonu, tēnei te mihi atu. E harei te mea kei te mihi au ki au anō, engari tēnei uri o Otaraua, e tuku mihi atu ana ki o tātou mana whenua, ki o tātou hapu. E tautau nei te ahika o tēnei whenua. Kia koutou katoa, ngā kanohi, ko tai mai, nau mai haere mai. Nau mai e rarau ki tēnei kaupapa, ki tēnei kōrero, I te pō nei, hei aha, hei whai I tēnei mea te māramatanga. Hei aha, hei whakarongo. Ki e te hio ngā kai pūtai ao, e te hio ngā kai rangahau, kua roa nei te wā, e rangahau ana, e wānanga ana, e rapu ana, I ngā kōrero, I ngā nekehanga, I ngā hitoria, e pāna ki tō tātou maunga. Nō reira, tēnei te mihi atu. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to open our hui tonight, our talk. My name is Sciascia. I'm also one of the speakers tonight and have been asked to, in lieu of our whānau who are very busy at present, we have a big kaupapa here in Ngāmotu, in Waitara, beginning tomorrow morning, hosted by Ngāti Tama, one of our 8 iwi of Taranaki, where many of our tribesmen and women are busy doing stuff to prepare for tomorrow and the weekend ahead. So in lieu of our whānau, I have been asked to step in and open up our hui tonight. So I'd like to firstly welcome you to this space. Excited to share some of our kōrero from this research. And of course to hear your thoughts, your whakaaro, any of your questions, and we'll be taking some time to listen to you as well. So I'd just like to open with this karakia. E tau nei ki rungi a tātou katoa te wairua o ngā mātua tupuna. Nā rātou I whakatakoto te ara hei hiko I ngā mātātou ngā uri. I whakatōkia o tātou ngā kau ki ngā tikanga hei arataki a tātou. Kia ngā kau nui te hāpai I a tātou mahi katoa, I roto I te pono, I te tika, I te māramatanga, me te aroha anō o tetehi ki tetehi. E rongo whakairi ake ki runga turuturu ōwhiti whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e, tai ki e. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Thanks, Dee, for that opening, and acknowledge that there's a lot going on in the region at the moment. So Dee stepping in at the last moment. Kia ora to that. Oh, camera. My name is Todd Velvin. I'm the Group Manager for Taranaki Emergency Management based at 45 Road Street, so working for the region, employed by 4 councils. And it's a bit of our privilege to be working with our university partners to help present some of this new information and share it with our community groups to build a better more resilient Taranaki, and not only Taranaki, but share the knowledge with the rest of our family and friends around the North Island and New Zealand. So it's a great honour to have them here and partner with them so we can enlighten ourselves and hopefully prepare ourselves when the Koro does wake up and we deal with a volcanic eruption. A couple little bit of housekeeping rules from us here at New Plymouth District Council. Acknowledge them for letting us use the facility tonight. If there's any emergency by any chance, just to let you know that the little green men that are running out through the door, the green person running out the door there, that's the exit. You follow where you came in, basically, and we're going to walk up towards what is the Spark building, or the older generation, they're in the Telecom Exchange. So it's just a little 100 metre or 50 metre walk up the road, follow one of the staff. There's a few of us around, and that's where our assembly point is if we have to evacuate the building. But because we all know if there's an earthquake, let's drop, cover, hold, hang on to the chair, make friends with the person next to you, and any other sort of fire thing we're going to evacuate. If you need to use the toilets or the wharipaku at any time tonight, just out through the door, and it's just to your right. You'll see the symbols on the door. Feel free to get up any time. We're not going to tie you to your seats or anything. So just out through that door to the right. There is water and tea and coffee and biscuits. So if you feel like you're getting thirsty at all, or you need that little bit of stretch the legs, please don't hesitate to stand up at any point and step out there and get yourselves a drink. Pretty straightforward, hopefully. Now, turn it on. Here we go. So again, Dee's words, welcome. We're really excited here at Emergency Management Taranaki to have so many people in the room. It's really, really awesome when you put these things on. We're sometimes a little bit nervous who's going to turn up and show interest in things that can make the community a little bit more resilient. So we're excited that we've got this many people in the room, and we're holding another one in Stratford next Wednesday night. So if you've got friends and family that live in the south part of the region, pass the message on. They want to come along and have a listen. For us, we might as well kick straight into it. So we've got three presenters tonight. Those presenters are, you've already met the wonderful Dee, Sciascia, with the lovely kind words at the start. Sitting next to her, I won't go in the order of the photos, unfortunately, we've got Professor Tom Wilson from the University of Canterbury. And next to him, we've got Professor John Procter from Massey University. Those are our three speakers tonight. As they go through their presentations, as Dee said, there will be time for partai at the end, questions at the end. So we've got about half an hour scheduled for your question and answers at the end. So if you can hold your questions to them, that would be really great. We'll get through the presentations and then we'll open the floor up for a little bit of kōrero and see how we go. All right, without further ado, lovely Dee, welcome back.
Yeah. Is that good? Currently live streaming it to whānau, so just trying to get the camera. It's a little bit daunting. Yeah, no, awesome. Really awesome to be part of this research project. So just a quick intro. So as I said in my mihi, I am born and raised in Ngāti Ruanui and Ngāruhi Hinerangi, and also have strong connections into Te Atiawa. I do not live in Taranaki at present, so it's really good to come home today and see our beautiful maunga out in full force, welcoming us all home, all of us uri of Taranaki. But for the last 4 years have been a co-lead of the Mātauranga Aiwi workstream within the He Maunga Puia research program alongside John Procter. Massive learnings, and one of the main ones for me has been reconnecting in a different way to my maunga. And hopefully, as I go through my presentation, you might be able to see and feel some of those shifts that I've experienced through this mahi. So literally, this whakatauki for me has been manifested for many of our uri this weekend to return home to our mountains so that we can be cleansed by the winds of Tāwhiri Mātea. Hoki ki o maunga, kia pūre ai e ngā hau a Tāwhiri Mātea. And it is in these proverbial sayings and whakatauki that we're able to draw knowledge from, that we're able to see through the eyes of our ancestors and how they interpreted and understood the world around them, especially the natural world. And so I wanted to open up with that to remind us all that we have a connection to our mountain. And for us who have genealogical connections to one of our 8 iwi here, we have ancestral connections to our mountain. And so what that means is a really special relationship that we have formed over our lifetime based on our genealogical connections to that mountain. And it is through that relationship that we're able to connect, have respect, draw sustenance and strength, draw well-being, and also give back. So part of my role in this program as a researcher is to hopefully start to reconnect our iwi into some of this kōrero around the volcanology, the volcanic activity, and the volcanic future of our mountain. So I just want to also recognise and acknowledge that you may see the words maunga with an A and maunga with an O. Now recently, and I'll go through this in a second, we signed the deed of settlement for our mountain and the mountains surrounding it to be returned back to the 8 iwi. And within that legislation, we refer to our mountain as a maunga with a letter A. There are different schools of thought, and I would say none is incorrect. It just depends on who you speak to. So having respect and an awareness that there are 2 different spellings for the word mountain, maunga or maunga, but they essentially refer to our beautiful mountain, Te Kahu Tupua, outside there. Ka pai. So I want to cover off 4 main kaupapa in my talk. Firstly, I want to talk about the connection and relationship that we as uri, as descendants of our 8 iwi, have with our mountain. And that's a really important place for us to start. Also want to acknowledge Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo, which is the return of the mountain that happened on the 1st of September this year at Owai Marae. I also want to talk a little bit about how we interpret mātauranga, or our knowledges, our ways of knowing, being and doing, and share some of that kōrero with you to help you understand, I guess, the basis and the foundation for this research project, having been underpinned with mātauranga that is derived from around our mountain. I also want to talk about the importance of the centrality and centralising mātauranga within research alongside science. And despite controversy and some in academia discrediting mātauranga Māori or mātauranga āiwi, Māori knowledges or tribal knowledges that should not be sitting next to science, I'm here to tell you that it should be. And I'm here to tell you that we are championing mātauranga āiwi, mātauranga āhapu, and creating that space alongside science within the Maunga Puia project. Taku maunga meha meha. And apologies if you hear my voice getting a little raspy. I am just recovering from a cold, so I may need to take a swig of some water or something more harder if anyone's got it. But I'll do my best to try and maintain my voice for the next 15 minutes. So our mountain is a physical and natural manifestation of who we are as Taranaki Māori, as Taranaki uri. I'll refer to our mountain as Koro in this particular instance, but I respect and I acknowledge that we are referring to a group of mountains alongside Taranaki Maunga. So Koro is our source of culture, language and identity. Here's the embodiment of whakapapa, which is genealogy, and our ancestors. Our ancestors and their characteristics and their feats are reflected in how we feel about and the relationship that we hold with our mountain. We draw abundant spiritual sustenance from our mountain, and that is reciprocated in how we give respect, how we uplift, how we talk about our mountain as a grandfather. And so the name of this talk today is Tu Mai E Koro. Translated, that means, well, roughly translated, to stand tall, our mountain. And so we refer to Koro as Taranaki, as our mountain, and therefore that grandfather and mokopuna or grandchild relationship is essentially what happens When we as uri, we grow up around our mountain, that relationship to our mountain is very much like how you would imagine a grandfather and a grandchild. So our ancestral connection is about drawing well-being from our mountain. This image is taken from Aotearoa Marae in Okaiawa, South Taranaki, where I grew up, near Te Hawera. And it was the first ratification hui before we signed the deed of settlement for our mountain returning to us. But I want to acknowledge Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo, which is essentially our deed of settlement. And I'm very sure that you will all be aware that the mountain has been legally returned back to our 8 iwi collective of Taranaki. But Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo honours a commitment made by the Crown and the individual deeds of settlement for the 8 iwi of Taranaki to negotiate collective redress in relation to Taranaki Maunga and Te Papakura o Taranaki, which is previously known as our Egmont National Park. Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo centres on the establishment of He Kawa Tupua, a new framework comprising of 2 parts. The first, Te Mana o Ngā Maunga, which is centred on the legal recognition of the legal personality of Te Kahu Tupua, which is why we refer to our mountain as a person, Koro. He now has legal personhood as part of this redress. And that incorporates all of the physical and metaphysical elements as a living and indivisible whole. The second part is Te Mana o Te Kahui, directed towards Ngā iwi o Taranaki and the recognition and further reconnection of the relationship between the iwi and their tupuna maunga. A collective iwi governance entity, Te Tōpuni Ngārahu, will undertake statutory and other functions within the arrangements. The deed was signed on the 1st of September 2023 at Owai Marae by our 8 iwi and the Crown. And this is a really important historical step for us, one that the journey has been long and arduous. It has been generational. Many of my tupuna were part of that journey. My auntie was one of the negotiators recently in the last 5 years who passed and did not see this come to fruition. And so we remember all of those people who have been part and parcel of that journey to achieving this for our 8 iwi of Taranaki. And this is a really important thing to remember when we're talking about the mountain. And when we start to venture into discussions around volcanic activity and volcanic risk to people and place and land and water around the mountain, we need to also remember and recognise and acknowledge that this has happened and that this is now in legislation. But more so, our 8 iwi have had their maunga returned to them. He mea nui tērā, it's really important. Mātauranga. What is mātauranga? What is mātauranga Māori? What is mātauranga a iwi? And these are my perspectives, yes, based on research, but also experience. Mātauranga are our ways of knowing, being, and doing. It is intergenerational knowledge, stuff that is passed down to you from your grandparents, from your parents, often wrapped up into a waiata or a song that is sung to you as a baby. And that song continues with you into your life. You keep singing it and then you sing it to your babies. And that is mātauranga being intergenerationally transmitted from grandfather or grandparent to mokopuna. Mātauranga is informed by and derived from a Māori way of seeing the world. It's guided by traditions, customs, rituals, protocols, and practices. But it's also inspiring, and inspiring innovation, and it can create new knowledge. So mātauranga is not just ancient traditional stuff. It is, but it is also new knowledge and creating new knowledge. And that's the exciting part. It is both esoteric as well as widely known. And so esoteric knowledge is that knowledge that is only closely guarded and protected within families or communities. And it should be that way. But also mātauranga can be widely shared, widely accessible, and disseminated to public. Mātauranga is expressed through a number of languages, both written, verbal, visual, and it's underpinned by a Māori worldview, and how we see the world. As an example, I've got 4 examples or 5 examples of how mātauranga is expressed. And these examples are also key projects within our research around an unearthing and reclaiming of some of our mātauranga to do with Koro Taranaki. So kōrero tuku iho, or knowledge that is passed down. This wharenui, for example, located in South Taranaki, which is my marae, represents local hapu knowledge, genealogical connections to the area and to neighbouring hapu, and identifiers like riverways and streams that connect the maunga, the mountain, to the moana, to the sea. The carvings depict bodies of knowledge that have been held by families for generations, but is expressed through artistic interpretation. If you've been onto a marae, perhaps Ōwai, or any other marae around the Ngāmotu area, you will understand what I'm talking about when you walk into a carved house. Every part of those carvings represent a kōrero, a story, and therefore derived from mātauranga. Waiata and haka. Our waiata, our songs, are another method by which mātauranga is stored, preserved, and disseminated. Esoteric knowledge that was limited for specific people were often encapsulated in laments and recitations, and these laments were recited and rote-learnt, thereby enabling individuals, usually tamariki, to recall genealogies, histories, and narratives easily and efficiently. And yes, that method is still being used today. I still sing all of our waiata tawhito, our old songs from Taranaki, to my children at bedtime. And one day they will understand what they're singing about. They may not know yet, but this is another form and expression of how mātauranga is manifested. Our mātauranga were our oral records of our knowledge and histories, and are used in this way today. Reo aiwi, localized language. Localized language is a good translation. Localized and tribal languages are a significant method by which mātauranga is accurately and appropriately expressed. Traditions, rituals, and protocols are often given effect through the language we speak. Like waiata, our mātauranga is encapsulated in our language. Part of this research, we took some time to unearth the vernacular that our ancestors, our tupuna, may have used when referring to or describing a volcanic event to do with our mountain. Understandably, we, today in 2023, we may not be as familiar with such terms in our language corpus, in Te Reo o Taranaki or our reo, as we have not experienced a volcanic event in Taranaki in the last several generations. And so the project was about unearthing those terminologies to bring them back to light and to bring them back into our use as we start to venture into some of these insights around a potential eruption for Koro Taranaki. And toi. And I just want to mihi, acknowledge our artists in the room who often cause us and force us to think critically, to think differently, to think outside of the box or the square or the circle that we are operating within, and drawing on that creative and artistic way of expressing oneself. Our artists cause us to be very critical and interrogate the world. And it's a beautiful thing. If you haven't had that experience, I recommend you have a good wānanga with an artist. But I want to acknowledge that rangahau research is encapsulated within our arts. And indeed, mātauranga is encapsulated within our arts. Our artistic and creative visual languages are expressions of mātauranga, and they are incredible sources by which mātauranga is held. Like the carved meeting house I shared earlier, or this beautiful heitiki carved by none other than Rangi Kipa, they provide an outlet where mātauranga can be interpreted and expressed freely. We're very fortunate to have 2 of our Taranaki artists join this research program and to create 2 works of art, again, to interpret and understand and express what mātauranga, localized mātauranga to do with the mountain through artwork. And we have one of our artists who has completed that artwork, and we have another one beginning very soon. I believe it's quite provocative to have arts and expressions of arts within research, and in particular within a Western academic space, because it's often referred to or thought of as kind of airy-fairy, not really, hard facts, but we challenge that because we understand that this is a receptacle for our mātauranga that exists within our arts. Lastly, our taiao. I want to acknowledge our tohu taiao, the signs that we see and we engage with within the natural world. And these signs often tell us, without having any scientist or any academic around, that there is something going on with the environment, that there is something going on with our maunga. And so through this project, we've been trying to lift up those tohu taiao and creating opportunities where our rangatahi in particular, those working on the maunga, are enabled and supported to analyse and research and wānanga what some of those tohu taiao are. And they give us the ability to read the stars, the winds, forecast weather patterns and systems, and we draw on our tohu taiao related to the maunga around monitoring of waterways and activities. Our mātauranga guides us to better understanding potential volcanic activity, and I know John's going to speak about that soon. Our taiao in and of itself is a manifestation of mātauranga. You sort of can't go past our natural environment as a body of knowledge. Centralising mātauranga in this research has been my flagship piece of mahi. And I know sometimes I can get a little bit, harp on and go on about it with my research team and with my colleagues, but I'm here to ensure that when we think about our maunga, we need to think about its connection to its uri, to its people, to our iwi, and lifting up and acknowledging and respecting their knowledge around the mountain. I'm nearly finished, guys. So it's about centralising mātauranga within this program of research, prioritising space, which also means prioritising funding to support our iwi researchers to come into this space. It also means freeing up money so that we can take this same kōrero to our marae around the mountain. We heard there's going to be one next week in Stratford. I'm working with the team to figure out how we can take these to our marae as well. But we have, for the last 4 years, been engaging with our iwi around the mountain on this kaupapa. It's really important that we engage our iwi when it comes to our mountain and engaging them in the right ways. Timing is everything. Timing is everything. And while we were going through a whole COVID situation with this program, we were also wrapped up into the deed of settlement and that whole process as well. Now that that is completed, we're hoping that we're able to get around to our iwi and have these conversations. So for me, I see that there is a really important opportunity for us at this interface where mātauranga Māori, our iwi, our hapurane, and science can come together. Now, this is not always the case. You don't always have to have that sort of interface where we have to weave mātauranga and science. It needs to be assessed. It needs to be understood. Perhaps it's just a kaupapa where mātauranga is the lead and that's it. Perhaps it's a kaupapa where science is leading and mātauranga is there to support, vice versa. And so the point of this diagram is to represent that we are, there are equal opportunities for us to be complementary of each other. And one of my key messages to my colleagues and also all of our iwi that have been coming into this project has been that we have this opportunity to create better research, better science, better outputs and better outcomes for our communities, our iwi and our people if we have the two side by side. Hoi anō, e mihana kia tātou, kei te whare, ka tuku anō te rākau kōrero ki taku hoa kaimahia, John. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce John Procter. Kia ora.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna move. You're good. Let me stand back a bit. How's that? Okay. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for coming out tonight. I've been told I've got 15 minutes to talk about some of those hard facts, present about 200,000 years of history of the volcano, and try and make rocks exciting before we get on to the really cool stuff about how the volcano is going to destroy everything. So let's see how we go. To really understand our volcano, we need to take a wider look at the landmass of New Zealand, and particularly the North Island. And if we look at Te Ike Maui, our wriggling fish, which sits on top of these plates here, we have the Australian plate and the Pacific plate, with the Pacific plate being pushed underneath the Australian plate. And as that happens, the Pacific plate melts, and that melt rises up through that crust and produces volcanoes at the surface that we all see in the central North Island. But we also see volcanoes here in Taranaki and all the way up to Port Waikato as well. And so a lot of our science is around understanding some of those processes, but also trying to think about what might happen in the future as well, and how that drives volcanism and volcanic hazards as well. To have a closer up view of Taranaki, this is the proposed model that scientists and geochemists argue about, and they argue about this every day down the corridors at Massey, between Massey and Auckland University, about what this really looks like under the ground, because we can't really see under the ground what's happening. But this is a general model that about 30 to 25 kilometres, we have this boundary between the crust and the mantle where we have this melt of material, of what everyone kind of considers basaltic material, that then can migrate up through this dense crust and form these pathways. And as it migrates up through, the rock changes from being basaltic into andesite. So the andesitic rocks that we see out on our volcano here and our landscape here gets produced somewhere around 14 kilometres. And then as magma moves up to about 6 or 5 kilometres depth, that's when all the volcanologists in the country start to worry, because it's getting really close to coming out. And so we really need these geochemical models to help us understand when material might erupt out and when it's getting to the surface ready to erupt out as well. And how do we know this? Well, if we look at our rocks here, this is a typical Taranaki rock here. We see these little black crystals within this grey sort of ground mass, what we call. If we take those crystals out of the rock and we look at them under a microscope, we see these rings. They're like growth rings around a tree. And these growth rings and these features on these crystals tell us about how that crystal's grown and evolved at depth and then come up through that crust as well. And we can look at the crystal, if we look at the chemistry associated with these rings and these features in it, we can get patterns of how the chemistry changes through time as well. And that chemistry, as it changes, gives us an indication of what depths that happens, what temperatures that happens as well. And we can start to build more accurate models of how that material moves up through that crust and erupts out as well. But sort of come back to Taranaki and provide a bit more of a geological overview of Taranaki as a region. We have this lineament of volcanoes. The oldest ones are the Sugarloafs, dated at about a starting volcanism about 1.75 million years ago. And as we move south, we come to Kaitaki about 500,000 years ago. And Puakai sort of started about 250,000 years ago. And each one of these volcanoes become dormant, and the next one moving south become active. And right now, the active area, or the active volcano, well, not active, but the volcano where most of the activity is occurring now is Taranaki, which we see started about 200,000 years ago. But for us to sort of look at a detailed volcanic hazards aspect, which Tom's going to talk about later, we know that the last eruption was around 1790 to 1800. Since then, we've been in one of the longest quiet periods in the last 1,000 years. So before that, the volcano was constantly erupting and very, very active, and where some eruptions and eruption episodes lasted for about 20 to 50 years, ongoing continuously. And so coming back to Dee's point, in the last 150, 200 years, we haven't really seen any major activity at Taranaki. There's been no eruptions. There's nothing for us to sort of understand what those eruptions would do to affect the community. But Māori arrived here and the volcano was constantly erupting and always changing its behaviour and activity as well. And so it's really good to sort of explore some of those historical narratives to see if we can get indications of how the volcano erupted back then as well. And so we have to understand our volcano, we really have to go backwards in time and understand the geology and the entire landscape as well. And so over the last probably almost 70 years or so, the university has been traipsing around the landscape here, understanding the geology and the soils and how this landscape was actually created. And we see here that the major geological rocks or lithologies that we see in the landscape are a result of debris avalanches, lahars, and pyroclastic density currents with some tephra from eruptions interspersed in them. And so I'll talk about those three main rock types as I've probably got about 5 minutes left now, haven't I? But if we look at Taranaki here, we see the cone or the massif, where we might refer to it as the lavas that everyone thinks or associates with volcanoes. Is a very small feature in the landscape, actually. And so these are sort of bounded within probably an 8-kilometre radius around the volcano, and they make up only about the last 10,000 years history of the volcano. And so when we map out the rest of the landscape, we see the 200,000 year history of this volcano is actually around in the ring plane. And so we really want to understand what's caused all this material to be produced and then flow out around the landscape, creating this peninsula as well. We also see that the cone is probably about 15 cubic kilometres of material, where there's probably about 200 cubic kilometres of material in that ring plane, we call it, creating our peninsula. So Taranaki looks like this today, but in the past, over the last 200,000 years, it's looked like this at times as well. And so, and I suppose it will look like this again in the future at some stage, but there's a really low probability of that actually occurring based on current understandings of that landscape as well. And sort of it wasn't really until the 1980s that we understood this process. Let's see if that works. And even though scientists around Taranaki had been mapping the landscape and trying to understand what formed the landscape, it wasn't until 1980s that we had clear evidence that we actually knew what the process was from a volcano collapsing and then flowing out to the coast, producing these large, what we call debris avalanches. And that led us to develop models of what sort of cycles the volcano might go through. And so what we see is that the volcano edifice will grow and it will collapse and then regrow again. And as it regrows, it produces lahars, pyroclastic flows that then flow out and build up that landscape, the peninsula that we live on as well. And then we might have periods of quiescence where we have thousands of years where nothing happens. And then it'll go through that cycle again. And basically, from the mapping we've done, we realized that Taranaki went through about 14 of these cycles in its history. So about every 16,000 years, we see this cycle repeating as well. And probably some of the clues which guide us around our thinking around developing these models is that you'll all be familiar with these debris avalanche mounds, or these mounds around Western Taranaki. Farmers hate them. But these are mounds which are surface features of these large-scale debris avalanches. So as the volcano collapses, we're talking about 7 cubic kilometres of material might collapse away from the volcano and just flow instantaneously out to the coast. And we're talking something, a mass flowing at about 100 metres per second across the landscape, inundating the area up to hundreds of metres. And we love looking at these things around the landscape. You guys probably don't appreciate them when you go out to the coast and you think, oh, this horrible muddy rock. But these, we can see here, this is an image here from Volcanic. We go out to the coast there, we see this large debris avalanche deposit. You see all these rock fragments within a brown clay-rich matrix. And underneath we might see another one. We see a little soil or break which is one of these periods of quiescence, and then another debris avalanche here. So we name them, we date them, and that helps us understand that record and define those probabilities of what might happen as well. There's also for us some really cool geological features in here that gives us a clue around how this mass moved and flowed. So we see large chunks of the volcano broken up and distributed amongst that mass as well, which gives us can give us information to develop models of how that might flow as well that we give to physicists and numerical modelers. And so this is just a schematic of how these things might flow from the volcano. We see at the top of the volcano or closer to the volcano, you see the mounds, which are really big and large. And as we move away from the volcano, this material stretches and breaks up and then flows out. And then we see what we see at the coastline here. And we see the same pattern in the way the mounds are distributed as well. Move quickly on to the next major lithology or volcanoclastic depositional unit that we might see around the landscape. And these are lahars. And I've spent last 20 years, I suppose, wandering around Taranaki, mapping the landscape. And I know the farmers around Wairea and Western Taranaki hate these deposits because they're hard and they're sandy, and you can't break them up, you can't plough through them, and they're also very resistant to allowing water through as well. But these sheets of material here are basically lithified, sandy, what we call diamix, with a few small centimetre-sized clasts in there of various eruptive material. So as the volcanoes collapsed away, there'll be a big hole in the volcano, a scarp, and so as it erupts and grows up again, it's producing new material over and over again, and that material then gets remobilised or moved away from the cone across the landscape and deposited across the landscape as big sheets of alluvial fans, like large floods. And this is a sort of this is a video of one of these lahars flowing across the landscape in Semeru and in Indonesia. And so these flows, people are very familiar with them at Ruapehu, but these are sort of mixtures of rock and sand and mud flowing at about 10 metres per second across the landscape. But they're not flowing like water, so they're not like a flood. So there's about 60 to 80% of the material in that mass is actually rock and sand, and only 20% being water. So it makes it very hard to model and simulate the physics of these flows and then provide simulations for hazard analysis. And so this is some of the science that we work on, is trying to model these flows for hazard analysis. The last type of flow, which we are really concerned about and spend a lot of time trying to understand, are these pyroclastic flow deposits. And this is a photo from Blue Rata Reserve, one of the quarries there. It just looks like a pile of boring rocks. And everyone would think, well, it's just been a large flood deposit that's come over from the river. But actually within there, you might see some fine sandy layers through here. And within these sandy layers, you might find large charcoalized logs where big trees have been burnt. And so these aren't flood units. These are actually flows of material that have come down as a mixture of hot gas and rock. And so we're talking anywhere between sort of 300 degrees up to about 900 degrees Celsius. And moving probably anywhere from 100 meters per second to up to about 400 meters per second. And so they come down very rapidly, very fast, and can burn everything in the landscape. And this is an example of one that we have some sensors on in Colima in Mexico. And this is sort of a very similar volcano to Taranaki, very similar sort of channels and history as well. And it looks like it's doing nothing, doesn't it? It's going to come. And then it wipes out one of our expensive sensors. But you can see how fast it moves there and just obliterates everything in the environment. And so we can see stacks and stacks of these sort of pyroclastic flow units higher up on the volcano. And some of these units here are actually airfall tephra. So as the volcano erupts, produces a large eruption column, the rock will fall out of that eruption column and form these ash beds as well. And so we get ash beds, we might get soils where there's been a period of quiescence, and then a pyroclastic flow and an ash bed. And so a lot of the scientists in the program spend a lot of time understanding these layers and the sequence of these events to build up these scenarios of what might happen, what happened back then, and that helps us inform future scenarios of what might happen as well. And so it's like someone's moving to get me off stage, is it? No? And so one of the things that we, not only do we try and build up those scenarios of what happened in the past to inform what might happen in the future, we also try and date and put ages around past events. And one of the easiest ways of understanding probabilities of what might happen next is to look at the ash falls and the eruptions over the last 30-odd thousand years of Taranaki's history. We work out how many eruptions have actually occurred. And we see that eruptions occur at different points in time. So they're not all equally spaced. So it's not like we can actually say, well, over the last 30,000 years, we've had one at every 1,000 years. And by the way, we're going to have one tomorrow. There's actually a lot of complicated statistics involved, and then trying to build models of working out forecasts or probabilities of what might happen. And so the common one that we use today is 30 to 50% chance of an eruption within the next 50 years. So within your lifetime, we will probably see an eruption occur based on what we see in the last 30,000 years. And not only can we do that, we can start to understand what size of eruption might occur. And once we have that information, we can then start defining probabilities around different events occurring, like pyroclastic flows and lahars occurring at various locations around the volcano. And basically here, look, I missed out a 0 in the debris avalanche here. But anyway, the pyroclastic flows, we're looking at a small scale eruption that we may have seen in the last sort of 500 years. There's probably about a 50 to 60% chance of a pyroclastic flow occurring. If we get a much larger eruption, then there's almost 100% chance that we're going to get pyroclastic flows or density currents, as well as lahars occurring with those events as well. So Taranaki, even though it's considered dormant, will reawaken at some stage. And but as he reawakens, he will give us signs that he's reawakening as well. And this is where GeoNet and GNS are heavily involved in producing new research and information around monitoring our volcanoes. And GeoNet does a really good job of monitoring our volcanoes across the country. And through that monitoring information, they have the horrible task of deciding alert levels that can then trigger warnings and trigger actions in the community as well. And I think here, Tom wants me to remind everyone that there will be signs and signals of unrest before an eruption at Taranaki. And there is monitoring equipment out there that will detect some indication that the volcano may reawaken. As part of this research program, we're also looking at new ways to monitor the volcano. So what other ways can we monitor the volcano? What other information can give us an indication that the volcano is going to reawaken? And this is work from Cindy Werner, who's sitting over there in the audience, and she's lives here in Taranaki now, and she's been wandering around the landscape looking for warm springs and cold springs and looking at the water that's coming through those springs and finding that some of our warm springs around Taranaki actually is connecting with magmatic gases and old magmatic sources of volcanic eruptions as well. And so, last couple of slides here, even though we have all these indications of a volcano reawakening, so we might detect gas, we might detect changes in those water chemistries, we'll have earthquakes as magma is being injected, and we might see things occurring, hot springs occurring at the surface. This will give us an indication of what sort of eruption, of what sort of volcanic hazards we're likely to see in the future. So I've only focused pretty much on ashfall, pyroclastic flows and debris avalanches, but we can actually have all these other volcanic hazards occur as the volcano reawakens as well. And once it reawakens, we actually have to be concerned, or we're actually concerned about those secondary effects once we see all these things changing in the environment, such as acid rain from eruption columns, lahars from material being deposited on the side of the cone and then washed away when it rains. And we're always worried, or I'm always worried, about a debris avalanche occurring at Taranaki. So yeah, we'll see what happens next. And here's probably my final slide of all the different types of hazards we're likely to see at a volcano, but not likely all at once. And I'm going to pass it over to Tom, and he's going to go through the sort of scenarios we're likely to see from these hazards occurring.
Oh, kia ora koutou. My name's Tom Wilson. I'm an academic based down in Christchurch at the University of Canterbury. My background is around trying to understand what the impacts of volcanic eruptions have on society. So things like critical infrastructure and farming and that sort of thing. And had the privilege of working with John and Dee for a number of years, and really grateful for the collaboration that we have with Taranaki Emergency Management. As John said, I'm going to build on what John and Dee have presented already with that fantastic foundation and explore a little bit around what a future eruption might look like and what we might experience here in Taranaki and what some of the things that you can do to prepare for it. Sorry, I'm like super nerd, but I'm going to have to go through some terminology just to lay things out, but hopefully it'll help a wee bit. So on the left there, we've got physical processes. So things that John has been talking about, like lahars or pyroclastic flows or ashfall. And then we've got what's exposed, and I've got young kids, so I'm going to use the metaphor of the three little piggies and their different houses. So the physical process is the big bad wolf huffing and puffing and doing whatever they're doing. And then you've got what's exposed, which might be houses or your three little piggies, or it could be cultural assets or whatever. But we relate those two things through this notion of vulnerability. So with the three little piggies, they've got their houses built out of straw, timber, or sticks and bricks. And they're all three houses, but they're made out of different things. And they're going to resist the big bad wolf's breath in different ways. So that's that vulnerability coming in. So the physical process stays the same, but it's how we've built and the choices that we've made of where we build, how we build, and so on, that becomes important there. And then that gives us what the likely impact might be. And if we add a probability to that, then we've got risk. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Lesson over, or at least that part of it. So one of the things we've used a lot, because volcanoes are complicated, there's lots going on with them. So we tell stories. And one of the ways that we try and formalize that is through scenarios, as John was talking about before. And they allow us to tell a story about what might happen in the future. These things are complicated. There might be a whole range of different outcomes, but being able to pull together what something might look like, it helps us to understand a little bit more and perhaps to even start planning around it and thinking about what we need to do. So as part of our recent work here in Taranaki, we've developed 9 different scenarios in partnership with emergency management and a variety of other organisations to show off the range of different things we think the maunga, or the Taranaki maunga, might be capable of doing. And so I'm going to walk through one of the large eruption scenarios and what that might look like. So when the volcano, as it's ticking away at the moment, when it starts to wake up, what volcanologists call that is they call that going into a phase of unrest, where different signals, like as the magma might start to move, we might start to see earthquakes or maybe different changes with different gases coming out, which Cindy and others would be looking for. Or maybe the volcano even starts to deform a little bit. And so we call that the volcano going into a phase of unrest. How long that goes on for is dependent on what that magma does and where it goes and how quickly it might rise. But that's a really important time, because that's when we're trying to pick up what's that magma doing, what's it going to, or when is it going to erupt, and how big might that eruption be? So that all that information or knowledge that Dee and John's walked through before can start to tell us what we need to do and how we can keep ourselves safe and hopefully resilient. So we'd see unrest kick off, and then we'd see the sort of emergency management and science systems swinging into action. So one of the things that we'd see is GeoNet raising the volcano alert level. So here in Taranaki, it's at 0 at the moment. And as soon as they see that signal starting to rise and they're confident that it's volcanic activity, they'd raise that to 1. And then they might raise it to 2. And then 3 is when we're into eruptions. So it's quite a short scale. So any change in the alert level at Taranaki is a significant one. So look out for that. If you ever see a volcano alert level change, it's time to switch on. It's likely we'd see evacuations potentially, certainly in the park. If there was a high degree of confidence that we're likely to see an eruption, we'd see the park swing into evacuations, and it might go further. It's very timely at the moment. We're in Iceland. There's an evacuation order underway for one of their towns, where it looks like there's an imminent volcanic eruption there. So it's quite an interesting one to follow, and lots for New Zealand to learn from that as well. There's quite a bit in our media about that if you're interested. What we might then see is an eruption occur. And in this particular scenario, it's a scenario of what a larger eruption for Taranaki maunga might look like. And so that would involve a big explosive eruption. And I'm going to show you a video in a minute of what that might look like. So we'd see ash falls and pyroclastic flows being produced. One of the things that we might start to see is, just trying to see if I can get that to work. Sorry. How do I get the videos to work?
Middle button.
Maybe it doesn't want to behave. Nope. Have we got any alternate way we can get it to start? Where's the tech guy? Oh, thanks, Kate. Thanks so much. So this is what a large eruption from Taranaki Maunga might start to look like. So this is an eruption in Chile of Calbuco volcano in 2015. And I think it's a particularly useful video because it's almost like you're sitting in New Plymouth looking towards the Maunga and seeing an eruption occur. And that's about the scale that you'd see there. This, of course, is a beautiful image at sunset, but it's quite significant where there's close to a cubic kilometre of material being erupted, and it's erupting up to about 8 to 12 kilometres into the atmosphere. Ash falls are falling all around the area, and you can see how much influence the wind is having on where that ash goes and where it's dispersed. The Chileans, they're quite humorous around it. It's a very serious topic, but they're quite humorous because they refer to Argentina as their ash pit or something to that effect, because a lot of their westerly winds push it all towards Argentina. But you can see here it's a significant big eruption, and for those of you with keen eyes, you'll see there's quite a lot of activity, like little pyroclastic flows happening close to the eruption vent there. So that's something we'd sort of comparably see here in Taranaki. This, of course, would push ash towards Auckland, depending on which way the wind's going. We'd see ash falling out 10 to hundreds of kilometres away from the Maunga. So parts of Taranaki region would receive a lot of ashfall, and that would go well beyond out across the central North Island, depending which way the wind's blowing. I'll just backtrack one, and we'll run through what these pyroclastic flows look like. Because in addition to John's, to be frank, terrifying pyroclastic flow video, here's another one that'll get you going, where this is a eruption from Japan, so Unzen volcano. And one of the features of Taranaki volcano is it erupts these big lava domes. So it's kind of like toothpaste-like lava. And it forms these big domes where they get sort of pushed out almost like an onion with different layers. And they become gravitationally unstable and bits fall off. And then it produces these pyroclastic flows. Happy to report those people are okay. But what you can see here is the violence, or just how energetic those flows are, where they're flowing down very, very quickly. They're very hot. And what's masked by that sort of rising cloud is these big blocks of volcanic debris that are crashing along as part of the flow. Very, very destructive. So again, that's a real feature of what we would see from eruptions at Taranaki. So it's one of those things that we put a lot of effort into to try and understand to inform where or how we can be safe around them. So one of the things that we're a little bit blessed with here in Taranaki is we have the park boundary, where there's been a lot of development limited by the national park and the various manifestations that have occurred there. So a lot of those eruptive processes we think will be constrained mostly inside that park boundary, which is a degree of relief. But one of the things that we're very confident on in almost any eruption is we will have ash falls. So where fine pulverized pieces of very fresh, brand new rock is ejected up into the atmosphere and then dispersed out. And there's a whole bunch of different factors that we've got here, which will determine where that ash goes and how much of it you might get. But it wouldn't be out of the ordinary if we had ashfall here in New Plymouth during an eruption, and then a couple of hours later, Stratford gets it, and then a couple of hours later, South Taranaki gets ashfalls as that wind swings around. So it's can be a really challenging hazard to manage. Ashfalls can cause a range of different challenges. Of course, impacts to our critical infrastructure, to human health, and so on. One of the things that we've focused a lot on here in Taranaki is your critical infrastructure systems, where particularly for your electricity network, you've got there's one entry point, or one GXP as they call it, or grid exit point from the Transpower system, where it's coming in all through Stratford. So the Stratford GXP is about, from memory, about 12 or 10 to 12 kilometres almost directly downwind of the summit of the Maunga. So with your predominantly westerly winds here, there's a really good chance that ashfall will fall onto that site. Why that is significant is that that brand new volcanic rock that's been produced and made into this volcanic ash, it's got quite a reactive surface on it. So it's brand new rock. It's got all these nice ions and so on there. And then as it's in the eruption cloud, all those volcanic gases, they're cooling down and they're absorbing onto the surface of that volcanic ash as well. So it becomes quite chemically reactive. So when you get that ash falling onto electrical equipment, and if you have a bit of that light misty rain that you sometimes can have, it becomes extremely electrically conductive, and you have a flashover or a short circuit. And that's one of the things that causes, in a sort of surprising way, causes one of the biggest impacts after volcanic eruptions that we've seen both here in New Zealand, which happened after the 95 Ruapehu eruptions, but also overseas. And so it tends to be one of the biggest challenges. The reason we're concerned with Taranaki is with all your electricity coming in predominantly through Stratford, it becomes a real vulnerability. So that's something that we've worked very closely with emergency management and Transpower around. One of the pieces of work which Alana Ware, who's one of the researchers that we collaborate with really closely, she developed a network model for Taranaki. And what you're seeing out here on the right-hand side, I suspect the thing that's catching your eye as it's moving around, is all the little nodes of how the electricity, the water supply, and the wastewater supplies are all connected up. And so it provides a bit of we'll use graph theory as the background behind it if you're interested. But what we can start to do is we can look at which of your nodes, your infrastructure nodes, or which piece of infrastructure is really critical for your region. So if we take the Stratford GXP, where all your high voltage electricity comes into the region, and we turn it off, it turns a lot of your network dark. And so as of a couple of years ago, that had been around about 50,000 dwellings without electricity, and potentially about 28,000 dwellings without water, unless there's backup power to keep the water pumps going. So it gives us a bit of insight as to what the impact of an eruption might potentially have on the region, and where we can prioritise our resilience efforts. So as part of this, so back to the scenario as we sort of walk through this. This scenario where we've had this large explosive eruption, and now we're into this phase where it's sort of frequent minor volcanic eruptions are continuing on. And because we're starting to get into the latter part of spring, we've had a big storm come through where there's been large amounts of rainfall. So that would probably start to trigger lahars. So as John showed before, we've got that wonderful video here of what that might look like. And so, of course, that would be potentially quite destructive to your bridges and to other different bits and pieces like that. But one of the lessons that we know from overseas, and as John was talking about before with the development of the ring plain in Taranaki, as these drainages fill up with ashfall and pyroclastic flow debris, we see that water or rainfall and snowmelt and so on flushes through them, and that sediment just keeps on coming. And it's a little bit like what we've seen over on the east coast of the North Island after Cyclone Gabrielle with all those landslides. As that sediment moves through those river catchments and out onto the alluvial fans or into your river channels, it starts to fill them up. And so sometimes, or very commonly, after eruptions like this, we see our rivers starting to fill up with sediment and skip out of the channels and start to spread out across the fans. So again, that's something that's, I tried to show that a little bit in the image there on the right. Apologies, it's a bit small, but that's where a formerly quite constrained river channel in the Philippines has filled up with sediment, and I think in that case, several meters of sediment has filled up across that channel. And of course, with your beautiful radial pattern of drainages coming off Taranaki Maunga, that's something again to be very cognizant of. I'm full of good news. The other challenge that we've got with Taranaki is a lot of your water supplies all come off the Maunga. So much of your surface water supplies are all draining off your beautiful mountain. And of course, the challenge that we've developed them during a period where there's been no eruptions. So we haven't had the issue of them being contaminated with ashfall or the intakes being damaged by lahars or whatever. But one of the big challenges that we've certainly picked up with a lot of the scenario work is where we have ashfall contaminating those intakes or knocking things out, we can see large disruption to those water systems. And of course, really challenging for our households and our communities, and also for our farming communities as well, who in many cases might be reliant on those reticulated systems, particularly in South Taranaki, for example. So an example here would be in this large eruption scenario where we see some of these reticulated systems disrupted and if not damaged, large numbers of properties potentially affected by water insecurity going forward, which, again, something to be really cognizant of if we enter into a phase of potential eruptive activity. The other final piece of great news, the other challenge that we have with some of these physical processes coming off the maunga with an eruption is with all these lahars coming out of our drainages. As I think from memory, Craig, we have over 700, 800 bridges in Taranaki. Oh, 2,000. Oh my God. Well done. Good. But I guess that gives a sense of scale of just how many river crossings that you have, which potentially could be disrupted by these lahars coming down. So again, this is one of the priority areas that we're putting a lot of scientific investigation into, of really trying to understand what these lahars might look like. Of course, knocking out those bridges means potential isolation of some of our communities and whānau. And of course, our bridges also carry other things, like our fibre cables for telecommunications, sometimes for our water supplies and power and so on. So it's, again, a real challenge to keep in mind. And as the scenario continues, the eruptions stop as we head back into summer, where we might go through a period of just unrest, where the volcano is burbling along and so on. And that might seem like a good thing, and it probably is. It's not spouting ash and so on. But the challenge would be, is it going to erupt again? So do we allow people back into evacuated zones? Do we start rebuilding our infrastructure? It's kind of that conundrum that we had down in Christchurch with the Canterbury earthquake sequence, where we had those big earthquakes, but they kept coming. So when do you press go on the recovery? When do you commit potentially hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that might be required to restore things? It's a really challenging one. So it's a real period of uncertainty. And then in this particular scenario, just for good measure, we have another eruption. But as John said before, this is the value of really trying to understand what this volcano has done in the past, that previous work where we have seen those eruptions continuing for years to potentially even decades, and so on. One of the things that I haven't had a chance to put a lot of farming things in there, despite growing up on a farm, but one of the pieces of work that we did was to look at, well, what about all the livestock? And so one of the areas that had always been a feature is in terms of how we might manage some of these challenges, I was, we'll evacuate the livestock. So I remember when I was doing my PhD many, many moons ago, I thought, let's test that out. So we developed a simple sort of geospatial model where we looked at that particular area, which was had about 50 mils or 5 centimetres of ashfall in a previous eruption from Taranaki. And so at the time, this was back in 2008, 2009, that was about 500 farms and around about 200,000 dairy cows that were exposed to this. And so we assumed that we would want to evacuate them all, and that we'd want to evacuate them away from the region so that they would be getting onto pastures that weren't affected by other ashfalls or anything like that. So it does assume an evacuation distance of about 200 kilometres from the volcano, which may or may not be realistic. But what we were able to calculate from that is with 20 truck and trailer units going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would take about 90 days to evacuate that head of cattle. If we had high availability, which at the time I was assured was a useful number of 50 truck and trailer units working 24/7, it would take us just over a month to evacuate that 200,000 head of cows or head of stock to get out of there. So evacuation, it's a massive logistical challenge, but the logistics aside, it was, is there even the receiving pasture for those livestock to come into? So it's useful to kind of think through that almost as a thought exercise. The sort of respectful conclusion was evacuation may not be feasible on a large scale at least, and possibly better to think about ways to shelter in place or so on. So I've walked you through a little bit of a scenario here. I'm conscious of time as well, and I'm sure there's a few questions. I can also see a few people, including my team, starting to nod off, so good time for me to wrap up. But the thing I wanted to stress is we've just painted one potential story. It's just a scenario. The next eruption from Taranaki Maunga almost certainly will be different, but it does give us some insights as to what we might take away from this. I think a really key thing that's important to remember is it's not going to be just a quick thing. It may be an eruption that continues for many, many years or even decades, and your whole way of life may shift, like we did down in Canterbury with the earthquakes, and sadly like some of our friends and families over in the East Coast and North Island are having to deal with all these cyclones. The challenge as well is when we do put all that sediment onto the Maunga, is that will keep working through those river systems for a number of years. So whatever happens, it will be something that will be multi-year at the very least. So just to wrap up here, I think it's any eruption that we have from the Maunga, and even where we just have a period of unrest, is likely to cause some impacts. You'll certainly see the emergency managers getting stressed. You possibly see scientists running in because that'll be exciting to have a look at. But there'll definitely, sorry, but there'll definitely be a response here in the region. From what we can sort of get insights from around the world and other experiences here in New Zealand and Aotearoa, the direct impacts potentially could be severe, but they in many cases are likely to be very manageable. But they'll be very different in space and time, where different areas of the region sadly may be more affected than others. But I think for me at least, one of the really big learnings coming out of this and really reinforcing previous work, I guess, is some of those systemic impacts or the indirect impacts are really important to take note of. I talked through the electricity vulnerability for the region with one entry point for the Transpower network coming into the region. And whilst you've got generation inside the region, it's very reliant on that transmission network. Also identified those water supplies being a real point of vulnerability. So again, things to think about as we think about our investments and resilience going forward. And for you and the household as well, what you might want to have your supplies ready for. I think a point that I didn't really get time to unpack enough, but across the 9 scenarios that we really modeled, those systemic impacts were very consistent. So the same things kept coming up. And again, I should note the transport network as well there. But again, hopefully to finish on a slightly positive note, knowledge is power. And I know it's an overused term and can sound a little bit silly, but hopefully this knowledge allows greater preparation, at the very least greater awareness of where we all live and what some of the challenges that we have and how we inform our future decisions, both for you as an individual and your family, but also with your elected members and what you're looking for your organisations and councils and so on to invest in to keep you safe and resilient. I think the other thing that's really pertinent here is it's a difficult time. I mean, it's been a hell of a time in New Zealand and around the world. So where we are going to invest our precious money or time or resources or whatever, where we can get those co-benefits for our resilience investments. So it might just be that your volcano, whatever you invest in a resilience might help a volcano benefit, but also perhaps also for environmental quality or whatever it is that the priorities are. So the final thoughts, just as a way to wrap up, and I invite my other presenters to join me here going through these, but a future eruption from Taranaki Maunga is probably inevitable. It will happen, and there's a really good chance we'll see it in our lifetimes. The eruption will probably be difficult to forecast with a high degree of precision. There's some excellent minds and excellent technology and people and everyone feeding around to try and monitor and provide those insights. But it's still challenging. These are complex things to look at. As John did a wonderful job of explaining, there'll be multiple hazards or different processes that will be occurring with these eruptions, and they'll change through the eruption. So it'll be a dynamic process. And I think we've stressed this quite well, where it'll be likely very uncertain duration. Could be short, but it could also be quite long. And so again, thinking around that. So I've said before, knowledge is power. So know your risk, make your plan, and engage and share this knowledge with others is what we implore. And I guess just to finish on a slightly nerdy note, Taranaki Maunga, it's world famous in volcanology. You're so lucky to have it on your doorstep. Despite everything I've said. And And these scientific investigations will continue. But I guess what I really wanted to stress is that there is a really strong partnership between science and Mātauranga with the Taranaki emergency management and some of the wider organisations which are charged with keeping you as safe and resilient as possible. So we certainly will continue to keep that going. If you're keen to find more information, which is always a nice place to end, Taranaki Emergency Management has a terrific website. So the link's up there, but just Google Taranaki Emergency Management. There's lots of information on that. NEMA, or the National Emergency Management Agency, has their Get Ready website with all the tips and tricks of how to prepare for potential volcanic activity. So I'll be hoping you'll all go home and check that out and get your kits ready. GeoNet and GNS Science, it's where a lot of the scientific information is based, and you can see in real time the monitoring that goes on at Taranaki volcano through the seismic drums, which all comes through as a live feed on the website, which is cool to check out. And for those of you, and Teresa, I saw you in the audience, so I wanted to do a shout out. The Ministry for Primary Industries has a terrific range of advice around volcanic impacts for farming and primary industries. So check out their website. And then the International Volcanic Health Hazard Network has some bits and pieces on there as well, which are really useful. So hopefully some of those things might be helpful if you're interested in finding more out. But please do get in touch. And I think we've got 30. Oh, geez, I've prattled on. We've got a bit of time for question and answer. So I think at that point we'll wrap that up and transition over to Q&A. Kia ora. So we've got a bit of a panel. So there's the three speakers this is Dee, John and myself, and we've got a few other guest experts, so to speak, who are going to help us out. We've got a number from the Taranaki Emergency Management Office, Cindy Werner from your local volcanologist based here in Taranaki, and Graham Leonard from GNS is lurking in the room somewhere, floating around too. So over to Kate, who's going to manage the Q&A. Do you want us to park up?
Yeah, set up. Yeah. Do we have any questions? Yes.
I'm really interested in the cones in South Taranaki, like the Acushla, and they're so perfect and grassy, and I'd like to know their relevance to the monga and how that happened and why they're all so perfect and different sizes.
Do you mind
Sorry, that
question?
was
So the question was around
the mounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, the perfect cones in the Taranaki area.
Yep. So those mounds, we call them debris avalanche mounds. They're a surface feature of one of these large volcanic collapses, where we can probably say about half of the Taranaki cone collapsed away and flowed out as a single mass across the landscape extremely quickly, and inundates pretty much a third of the volcanic ring plane. And so those cones are sort of features left behind on the surface of that flowing mass that represents stresses and frictions that are very high within that flowing mass as well. The reason why they look all sort of perfect and nice is that they've been sitting there for about 25,000 years. And so they've sort of eroded around them a little bit. But there is sort of that solid rock, or that hard rock material that's all fragmented up, that retains that rubbly surface features as well. I can tell you that at Mount St. Helens, they're nowhere near as nice and round and smooth. They're all still a rubbly mess. That's horrible to walk over as well. But we find the mounds, there's those mounds that we see out to the west 25,000 years ago. We call those the Pangarehu Formation mounds. We also find mounds down to the south with other debris avalanche, and a few small mounds around Inglewood with some really old debris avalanches around 120 odd thousand. So.
But because they were hot, that they flowed too.
No, it's cold. So the mass is really just debris avalanches. As the cone grows up, it forms a large mass. Much like if you go to the beach and build a sandcastle, you pile up the sand, and gravity just can't hold it, and the material just can't hold that much mass in a steep cone shape, and it'll just slowly collapse away. Other triggers are, if we have a large earthquake, can also shake the cone and cause it to collapse. as magma rises up into the cone, if it's about to erupt, it can oversteepen the sides and cause that cone to collapse out as well. So we have a pretty good idea from worldwide examples what triggers those events and how they sort of flow as well. And we try and simulate them on computers to give an indication of what might happen next as well.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, can I keep use this if you want a live stream here?
E rua ngā pātai mō ti, tēnā koe whaia mō tēnei kauhau. He pātai tūtahi. For the maunga and the mātauranga at iwi hapu and whānau, how is it central to tēnei mahi rangahau? And also what resources have been created to spread this mātauranga and allow it to flourish?
Firstly, fantastic questions. So how is it centralised within the project? I think we can't go past the fact that we are talking about an ancestral mountain where 8 tribes think of this mountain as an ancestor. And so the centrality of our mātauranga to guide this research, while it hasn't always been smooth sailing, it's been a challenge to sometimes vie for that space and to have confronting conversations with our colleagues that we need to ensure that the mātauranga is underpinning this kaupapa. So I guess the ways in which we've been able to do that is to obviously create opportunities for our iwi to be involved as researchers. And so there's been a couple of programs that have been running within the program to enabling our iwi rangatahi, but also researchers, and that's an arbitrary term, as in they may be our whānau who are very interested in waiata, in songs. They may not have a PhD or a master's, but they're researchers. And so creating that space and opportunity for them to come in and to look at what their mātauranga is, how they wish to collate that, connect that back into their iwi, their hapu. And it's not for us to say, okay, now hand that over. So we're not trying to harvest that knowledge to bring it into the program. We're merely creating the opportunity and the platform for our iwi people to come in to be resourced to reclaim and unearth their mātauranga according to Taranaki. And if they so wish to share some of that or not, that's okay, that's kei te pai. Obviously within the wider program, there's a number of teams and scientists and researchers. And one of my things has been another way of activating mātauranga is to getting more Ds in the room. And yes, it is a little bit lonely sometimes because we are a minority within a large community of scientists. But that doesn't mean that we have a minority voice. And so constantly championing and standing up in front of crowds like this to ensure that we're pushing and we're reminding everyone that our mātauranga exists around our mountain. It sits within the safe hands of our hapu, our whānau and our iwi. And we will always hold that mātauranga, and if and when we are ready to share that with others, like I said in my presentation, then we will do so. But it's about making sure in the context of this, I guess this program, how do we look after our mātauranga if something was to happen? How do we reflect on our waiata and our whakapapa and our karakia that we know have descriptions already about our mountains? So it's just unearthing, reclaiming and reconnecting our people into that mātauranga.
I'm wondering whether any of the wildlife would alert something happening on the. Recently, we visited a volcano in Japan, and we were told how the local people there had prior knowledge of snakes that came out of hibernation, and those that responded to that, their lives were saved, and those that listened to the experts who were denying it, some lost their lives. So I just wonder, do you know, in other places around whether that sort of thing has happened, that there's alerted by the wildlife?
That's a great question, and this is really the value of exploring another culture's observations about the environment and their long history in the environment as well. And so we know, not from Taranaki but from Ruapehu, that we've experienced stories from Marae down the Whangai River where lahars regularly come. They say, well, lahar's going to come because all the eels will jump out of the river and wriggle on the land. And we never really saw it until 2007. The lahar came down, and as we're chasing the lahar down the river, as we got in front of the lahar, you'd see all the eels. You'd be tripping over the eels on the farmland as you're trying to get close to the water. And there's other stories out in New Zealand, across the country, around various species evacuating the area. Ruapehu is another good one, where they have a story of the marae will be filled with lizards that are coming down off the mountain as well, and that's a sign that the volcano may erupt. And so, it's really, they're really handy to understand and help inform new knowledge and new solutions as well. And that's part of the value of these types of programs, where we try and bring in as many different knowledge sources as possible to find those solutions.
Can you link in the hot springs, please, and the Inglewood fault, please, how that ties in?
Kia ora, everyone. I'm Cindy Werner, just so you know. So there's two types of mineral springs around Mount Taranaki. There's cold mineral springs up on the flanks, and then there's warm springs that are out on the ring plains. So we don't actually have any, technically, that are hot springs like you'd find in the central North Island, but these mineral springs are full of carbon dioxide, and that's a volcanic gas that's being emitted from the magma at depth. And this is happening now. And in the event that magma starts moving towards the surface, those gases are going to come out of solution and make their way to the surface in advance of the magma. So this is one of the ways that we're trying to increase the monitoring around Mount Taranaki, to look for these changes in geochemistry of the hot springs, because it might be able to give us a lot more notice. So say earthquakes might give you days to weeks to months, if you're lucky, of warning prior to an eruption, whereas the changes in the geochemistry, it's a very subtle change, but if you're looking for it, you might be able to have months of warning. And sorry, I don't know anything about the Inglewood Fault.
Yeah, most of the warm springs that Cindy's been looking at sit, well, pretty much at the top of Artefata Road, and it sits on another fault line called the Oanui Fault, or sits near that fault line. So there may be a relationship between the spring and the fault lines, but that probably hasn't really been defined too well yet. Don't think there's too many springs popping up along the Inglewood Fault, which is a lot further north. The Inglewood Fault sort of dips underneath the volcano, or comes up, or cuts through the volcano from east to west. And possibly the Kukawai Springs area may be related to some movement in those areas, but more probably related to springs and things. Is that right, Cindy?
We should talk about this.
I'm just interested in work that's going on around resilience, in particular around ash loading on roofs, and whether that's been considered with building codes and so forth for Taranaki.
Yeah, great question. So we've done a lot of work and collaborate with a lot of people that have looked at ash loading on roofs internationally. And as a really crude rule of thumb, you need a lot of ash to collapse a New Zealand building, because we tend to build our buildings relatively well with the snow loading and storm loading and so on. So as a very crude rule of thumb, you're looking at well over 10 centimetres, probably more like 20 centimetres, of wet, heavy ash to really get structural damage on the majority of our roofs. The challenges probably is in a region like Taranaki would be your long span, thinly engineered or finely engineered agricultural buildings, for example, or something like that, where the ash just can't shed off it terribly well. I guess one of the areas that really popularised the concern around ash collapsing roofs was the Pinatubo eruption in 1991, where some of you might recall there was a lot of roof collapse in that particular event, and sadly it led to a lot of fatalities. But the building stock, so to speak, or the buildings in the Philippines were very lightly engineered tropical style structures, very different to what we typically have here. So we've done a lot of work in Chile where they have similar building style around their volcanoes and kind of a similar climate as well. So the pitch of the roofs and materials and the cladding is quite similar as well. And that holds up pretty well at 25 centimetres, even 30 centimetres before you're looking at structural damage to residential properties, for example. I was going to say something else, but it sort of flitted out of my mind. Thank you. Thank you. Craig, we're just... even better. Thank you, Sarah. So one of the big challenges are your non-structural members of your building. So your gutters and so on, they tend to peel off as they're meant to. But for any of you that are on rainwater supply, that's one of the first things you want to disconnect is if you see an eruption occurring, disconnect your downpipe from your water tank because you don't want that ash getting into your drinking water. And then the other quirk of, so to speak, of ash events, and we see this a lot in Japan and Chile, is the biggest cause of casualties or injuries is people falling off their roofs trying to clean them under the sadly sort of false premise that they need to clean them off because otherwise they'll collapse. So there's it's one thing we've actually done a bit of guidance around and produced some guidance which I think is on the GNS website around safe cleanup practices for your roofs and so on. And that's for both the general public and for specialised contractors as well. Did I miss anything, Sarah, Craig? Ripper. Cool. Great question. Thank you.
I have a simple question. Do you have a evacuation model if there's an emergency?
Oh, are you going to talk about that? Due to the dynamic nature of an event like an eruption, we will basically, any evacuation plan that we come up with will be communicated through the means we already use, and it'll be specific to the communities. And what they've mentioned is wind, weather directions and stuff like that. So we don't have specific evacuation paths as such at the moment, but we have an evacuation idea of where we would need to send people. Most of the stuff around the volcanic eruption is shelter in place, unless we're seeing those lahars or those debris flows that are going to impact certain communities like Inglewood and places like that. So, yeah.
Right. Research has shown that, yes, it's going to blow up at some stage. Now, your actual monitoring, are you getting consistent, sort of leaning towards an eruption, or is it actually monitoring pretty stable?
Right.
Kia ora koutou, Graham Leonard, so I'm at GNS Science, I'm part of our volcano monitoring group. We monitor Taranaki, Monga, like the other active volcanoes in the country in a consistent way. So seismic monitoring, looking for earthquakes and also ground tremoring from magma moving inside the volcano. Cameras, obviously, pretty simple, but watching what the volcano is doing 24/7. We have a 24/7 operation center. We're looking for ground deformation as well. So we've got continuous, ultra-precise GNSS GPS stations around the volcano looking for bulging, effectively, bulging or ground surface changes. And we can follow that up every few weeks with satellite radar. So we can actually see a map of the ground deforming down at the millimeter scale. And then we're looking at the gross level satellite gas concentrations, but at the local level, we've got a first station in on one of the springs that Cindy's highlighted, where we get live data back, looking at chemistry and temperature from springs as well. And all of those have a long-term, basically flatline background. There are very few earthquakes in the Taranaki area in general, and they're not particularly going up or down. We're not seeing a bunch of seismicity, ground cracking around those magma chamber depths or locations under the ground. We're not seeing the type of ground tremoring that comes with magma moving through the ground. And because the crust is, cooled off over the last couple hundred years, we expect any new magma coming up in the top 15, 10, especially 5 kilometers is going to have to crack new ground. So we're going to get lots of seismicity there, and there's also that leading gas coming ahead of it, and none of that is being seen at the moment.
I suppose my question is around a little bit about the evacuation model. Obviously, you mentioned that would change depending on wind, etc., etc. But as the person at home wondering what to do, where would we get that information? How would that be communicated to us?
So any information that's going to be communicated is going to come from Taranaki Emergency Management Office or our 4 councils. So I can rest assure you, when you see the scientists running into the region, we'll be hopefully well ahead of that and communicating out to everybody. So we have a whole lot of tools and variety of means to get the message out, and some of those people get the annual test through the emergency mobile alerting system, our Facebook page, through radio, through newspaper, through multiple means. We'll be communicating what we want the communities to do. Our first initial messaging, given some of the scenarios we're looking at, is going to be that shelter in place originally. So that's where we need all community groups to think about what you have at your house. And it's that same old civil defence message, get ready, get through, thinking about what you have in your kits at home, and what do your neighbours have, and what do your parents or grandparents or your children or cousins or aunties and uncles, what do you have, and do you all have a plan that's well communicated to survive these, to get through these initial period of unrest or volcanic eruption. And that goes for any natural disaster or adverse event. But I can rest assure you, you will get communicated with in a very, very timely manner. We've taken all these learnings from other events around the world, around the country, that communication is key, as we've seen in the Auckland flood event in January. Okay. We're going to, one more. Okay, last one. That's the last question, then we're going to wrap up.
Just what's the risk of respiratory compromise during one of these ash falls?
Tom and I were drawing straws for that one. We actually have one of the global International Volcano Health Hazard Network scientists here with us. We have a volcano health forum tomorrow in Taranaki. We'll speak on Carol's behalf, Carol Stewart. A key thing with volcanic ash is it's not like fire ash. So the word ash is a bit of a misnomer. Volcanic ash is just ground up rock. Magma is being blown apart by gas, and it's blown apart into tiny little fragments and lofted into the air through that hot gas and by the wind. So you're getting sand and siltiness blown at you from a volcano. It's not carbon toxic ash like you see from a fire. It can have absorbed onto the surface some salts and some acids from that gas in the magma. It's not the kind of thing that's super toxic. If you get a lot of it on your roof and going into your water tank, you can have some elevated concentrations in water tanks. So it is a good idea to disconnect those roofs, but it's not like, we generally say drinking water that's had ash in it, you're much more likely to not be willing to drink it before it's at all dangerous. Similarly, breathing ash is not that different to breathing on a sandy day or a silty day. However, some people are pretty susceptible to that, especially people with pre-existing lung conditions or asthma and other types of conditions. So if we're going into an eruption and there are super vulnerable people in the community, they need to talk to their medical professionals about their standard concerns about their respiratory conditions and how that might affect them, because they could be going into a sandy, salty, dusty environment effectively. But other than that, it's not particularly, we've breathed in a lot of ash, even in active eruptions ourselves. And it's a dust, and we're still fairly normal. Was there anything else to cover on health there? That's about it. Yeah, actually, so shelter in place is the key, and staying indoors, right? You want to minimize exposure. You don't want to have kids playing in ash. You don't want to be eating ash off your veggie garden, that kind of thing. And you want to keep it out of your eyes, washing them with water, that kind of thing. Obviously, minimizing exposure is really good.
Thank you very much for tuning up. We'll end it there, but there are means to communicate through us, through our website, and reach out through different channels, through the 3 district councils or the regional council, through the emergency management advisors that exist in our district councils, or use any of the websites that the team have brought up. So thanks again for coming along. It's really exciting for us to have so much representation from the community. Just helps us get our message out there of getting ready and being prepared, and looking at these different events and utilising the science from our university partners, to share the love and share the knowledge. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all these wonderful people that are sitting up the front, and our three main speakers. Without them, we sort of a little bit feel like we're walking around in the dark. So it's our job now, emergency management in Taranaki, is to take the knowledge that they're imparting with us and hopefully share more with you, and make plans and look at how we can better adapt ourselves and become more resilient to Koro waking up. So thank you again for turning up, and I'm going to ask Dee if she'd like to close us. Thank you.
Ora Todd, tēnā koe me tō tīma, I āta whakarite I tēnei pō. Just before I do our karakia, a closing comment from me. I think a couple of weeks ago we had an Indigenous search and rescue guest speaker come to Owai Marae out there in Waitara. And one of the key messages he told us, and in the room were many of our iwi people from around the mountain, is that when we're talking about evacuation, no matter what the natural phenomena or disaster may be, we need to ensure that we're looking after ourselves. And so that key advice that he gave us was to ensure that you have a plan for your home and your neighbour. Obviously, around our mountain, we've got many multiple hapu and 8 iwi who will all be also thinking critically about how they're planning evacuations and looking after their people as well. We saw very quickly our iwi around the mountain stand up during COVID when that hit, almost overnight, and so we know that our iwi have the strategies and the intelligence, but also the capability to be able to respond in an urgent way, but also in a manaaki way to looking after its communities. And that's not just for its own descendants, it's for everybody in our community. So I guess what I'm saying here is that we need to plan ourselves and also look after our neighbours and rely on our communities to keep us safe as well. Hoi no, mihana kia tātou. Tēnā koutou, thank you for coming tonight. It is a little bit late, we're all 8:45. Hoi no, ko tai ki te wā. Ke whakairi I ngā kōrero ki ngā pakitara o tēnei whare kōrero I tēnei pō. A popo rā, ko tātou ko Ngāuri o Taranaki, ko tahi atu ki Ngāti Tama, ki reira whawhai ai I ngā hākinakina, I ngā kapahaka, I ngā tautohe tū mai Taranaki. Ana, me karakia tātou. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia I te urutapu nui. Ia wātea kia māma te ngā kau te tinana te wairua I te arataka atu. Ko ia rā e rongo whakairihia ki kirunga, kia wātea, ai rā kua wātea, rire, rire hau, pai marire.
Thank you. All right.